Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president at 1615, and I also serve as a church missions coach with the organization. Before we get started on today's webinar, I want to let you know about a few upcoming events that we hope you participate in. One is the mission table. Every month, the second Tuesday of every month, we roll out a new missions topic through a concept we call the mission table. We tackle some of the most critical and controversial issues impacting missions today. On April 12th at noon Mountain, we will be rolling out episode 2 this year, and we'll be addressing the question, does child sponsorship really work? You can register at missiontable.org. It's an interactive conversation. Not only do you get to hear from missions experts and leaders, but you're able to join the conversation and ask them questions. We also have another webinar coming up on April 20th. It will be led by Denny Spitters from Pioneers. This is a great topic, knowing who to send, predicting missionary fruitfulness and failure. So we'll be discussing the things you can do in advance, how you can be proactive in discerning and selecting missionaries in hopes that they will be fruitful on field. A lot of the indicators that would lead to selection, you can address those things early on and be preventative. So again, predicting missionary fruitfulness and failure. And then Ellen, who is on our webinar today, has an event coming up. Ellen, why don't you let our audience know about this event?
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, Interchange 2016 is coming up May 11 to 12. It will be held in the Philadelphia area in Southampton, PA, and our topic this year is missions and money. We frequently say we don't want missions to all be about money, but missions is an important aspect of money. So we're going to talk about the generosity side as well as strategy and stewardship. So encourage anybody who's involved in some aspect of mobilizing churches to join us.
And I want to put a plug in for that. I've participated in several interchanges over the years, and it is a great atmosphere, very interactive, great plenaries, but a lot of dialogue and interaction. So if you are in the area, I hope you'll participate in this event. Let's move on to today's topic. Today's webinar is one that I'm personally very interested in, and I'm really excited to present to you. The title is How Senior Pastors Catch Missions Vision. My senior pastor isn't interested in missions. Maybe you've heard that complaint before, or maybe you've said it yourself. The truth is that senior pastors can catch the vision for global outreach. In this webinar, we will focus on missions from a pastor's perspective and learn some ways to nurture their global passion. The how-tos in this webinar will come from someone with experience in this subject, a pastor. Today's subject matter experts are Ellen Livengood, who you've already heard from. She's the founder and president of Catalyst Services, and Dr. Lane Harrison, who serves as the senior pastor at Life Point Church in Ozark, Missouri. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ellen and Lane, but first, just a couple of details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today during the webinar, please type them in the question and answer panel located on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar task panel. We'll be addressing questions the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together. This is your opportunity to join the conversation. 45 people have registered for today's live webinar, and I want to remind you that this webinar is also being recorded and will be available for download at 1615.org in just a week. I'm going to be turning over the controls to Lane and Ellen. I want to thank both of you for taking time to serve the body of Christ in this way today. Ellen, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and thanks for the opportunity to share on what I agree is a really important topic. I think that there's a lot of questions that a number of missions folks have about, how do I work with my senior pastor in the whole area of missions? Sometimes it's a bumpy road. And I'm really glad that Lane has joined us today. Pastor Lane grew up in a pastor's home, and he served in pastoral ministry for over 26 years. In 2004, he planted and now pastors Life Point Church in Ozark, Missouri. His passion, as he explains it, is preaching the Word of God to lead the people of God to serve the mission of God and reach the whole world for Jesus. I really like that purpose statement. He regularly trains, assesses, and coaches church planters, pastors, and leaders through preaching and a regional network that he founded. So, Lane, welcome, and I just want to begin here with a question for you, give you an opportunity to tell people a little bit about your personal background and your path to developing a passion for seeing a church embrace its part in fulfilling the Great Commission. What did that look like for you personally?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Ellen. It's an honor for me to be able to serve in this way today. For me, I think this passion for missions was implanted very early on in my life. Growing up in a pastor's home, I can always remember being active and serving in our community, even taking a couple of short-term trips with us as a family early on. And so I think for me, at least the seeds of it were implanted very early in my life, even before I was a Christian, and just being active in serving in this way and being around it. So I think that was early on. I think in my early years of ministry, having already been practicing that way, we very much participated in local ministry opportunities, whether it was serving people in our community, trying to find ways that we could just be practical expressions of love, as well as serving people in the church and trying to build and foster that love among God's people within the body of Christ. And so I think those are probably the two most, just what I've witnessed and modeled. That's helped strengthen the teaching that I've had throughout my life, and then just coming to believe that was a natural expression. I mean, when the Bible calls us to love others, and it tells us time and time again that the way we love other people really is a true demonstration of how we love God, and our love for God cannot be separated from the way we love other people. And so I just think it's always been a very critical part of my training, development, and discipleship.
That's neat, and it sounds like you've kind of had missions, or at least certainly a passion for reaching people. It's been part of your personal DNA for a long time, and that's what we hope is true of every pastor's heart. But I know that sometimes some of the people who are listening to this webinar, I am guessing, will feel like perhaps there is those kinds of genes are not evident in their senior pastor, and they may be saying, yeah, but how do we inculcate that? How do we encourage that? And that's what we want to talk about today. But I just want to start out by kind of introducing a few things that I think are encouraging signs of, in general, of pastors opening to global ministry. What are some new factors that I think are encouraging pastors to think in this direction? The first one that I would mention is just a new emphasis in pastors' discussions on being missional. Now, some of you may not like that missional word, and I realize that missional means all kinds of different things to different people. But at least as a minimum, I think we are having conversations in local churches today that is really at least outwardly focused and not just inwardly focused, so that there is a sense of discussion in pastoral leaders about what does it mean to reach out, and that's a good starting point for missions. Another thing I think is a growing awareness of diaspora neighbors. In other words, people who are from the nations, whether they're immigrants or perhaps international students or refugees who are coming here. And as I talk to pastors and church leaders, we're increasingly saying, we've got a little community of this ethnic group here, or we're recognizing that God is bringing the nations to us. And that's automatically going to stir, I think, in pastors' hearts, that interest. Another piece is just that, particularly with younger leaders, I think there's an increasing value on collaboration and partnering. And that's exciting, because as we're thinking about doing missions, it's really incumbent on us to think about how do we do it in collaboration. And so I think, again, that's another great foundation for missions involvement. Another piece that I think is important is a heart of compassion for hurting people. And again, this is a millennial attribute that I just really appreciate. And I think it's also true in leaders, particularly from younger generations. And again, God can use that. Lane kind of described that as well. You know, a compassion and a conviction that we need to be ministering to people. There's outreach focuses happening at large pastors' conferences. I am guessing that when your pastor goes to one of these big conferences, of which there's quite a few now, that some sort of missions outreach is a part of what they're emphasizing there. And then lastly, I'm also encouraged because there's more ethnic leaders who are becoming part of church staffs. And again, I think as we get more multicultural within our churches and within our staffs, that's into that seeps a heart for people and an appreciation of nations that God can use. So I just hope that you see those kinds of things as encouraging and an opportunity to move people in the direction of missions. But maybe more specifically, Lane, I want to come back to you. When we're thinking about specifically a passion for the world, what would you define, what do you say that means for a pastor to have a heart for missions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I definitely think it's one that can be defined in a number of ways. But I think what I would see as three general headings for that. Really, it has to begin with the personal call to go. I think you can't read the New Testament and really you can't read the whole of God's Word and not see a personal responsibility for every Christian to hold this compulsion to go to every nation, tribe, and tongue. I mean, it's evident. And I know for me, while that call and really the teaching of understanding that was in my life very early on, there was a very specific moment. It was back in 2001. I was on a mission trip in Nicaragua, and we were having some quiet time early. The first morning we just traveled in, and it was before we left town that afternoon to go on site. And I was sitting at the motel reading before we left, and I committed to read through the book of Acts that week. And I noticed something I'd never noticed before. When the pronouns change from third person to first person, beginning around Acts 16, when Luke joins the team, it went from they went there and they did this to we and I, and the Spirit just really used that to break my heart with an urgency that missions must become personal, and that really became a deep conviction for me. So I think that first component is that personal call to go and where we see God's hand on us, leading us, and how we live, obedient and faithful to the Great Commission. I think the second call, the second component of that is really in our role as a pastor, as we lead the church, and the church is that sending agent where that seat of that sending authority is given in the New Testament. I think God wants to go, and as we are called to be under-shepherds to lead His people, how can we lead His people to follow Him if we're not going where He wants to go? And I think He wants every church, not in the same way, not even in every place, but I think as pastors we've got to see that call for the local church to be the sender to the nations and leading our people as we follow God where He is at work around the globe. And then the third component is just a practice of reading and praying and researching to continually grow and inform that missiological passion in our hearts. I mean, I know when I stop reading or when I stop fueling that passion, it wanes like any passion would. But as I read and pray, it helps me to interpret world events, even like what we've seen in Brussels yesterday. It helps me to see people differently. It helps me to understand my position and what I've got to be about doing among our people. And so I think these three main components really are what most critical to define a pastor's heart for mission to some extent and in some ways. And obviously each individual will be a little different or nuanced in one way or the other, but I think these are the basic components of it.
That's great. It's a great list to pray for your pastor for in each of those areas. I like those points. Why do you think, on the flip side of that, many pastors aren't excited about missions? What are some of the things that make it difficult as a senior pastor to exhibit that kind of excitement and leadership in missions?
Yeah, well, that's a Ellen, as we've discussed, that's a hard question. It really is, and I would never want a broad stroke in such a way to, paint everyone into a very simplified or oversimplified corner. But I think there are simply some that are surely not interested. But I would prefer, at the very least, give the benefit of the doubt to most pastors to believe that they love Jesus and they want to see the nations worship Him in obedience to His Word. And so, with that kind of general disposition in mind, I would probably I would set forth maybe some primary issues that create real challenges for most pastors, because believing that they want to, giving them the benefit of the doubt, that doesn't dismiss the fact that there are some very real and significant challenges that we face. And I think the first challenge is just simply the task versus the resources that we have at hand. Resources can be so limiting and seem limited at times. Even in the beginning of our time here today, you're going to lead that session on missions and money. And the fact of the matter is, it takes money. And if the budget's tight and giving is tight because of whatever the case may be that's causing it, it's very easy to postpone thinking about things that are going to cause us to spend more money and even to prioritize more church-serving type ministries, because you kind of get in a protectionistic mindset. And so sometimes I think we get to thinking, well, when the resources are available, we'll go after this. And that's a real challenge, and one that we have to push ourselves out of as lead pastors too, and say, we need to invest our money, our resources, in what is our first priority. And if we do that, and I think the missions and go to the nations has got to be on the table with whatever other list of first priorities we have. The nations must be right there in front of us. And so I think that's a big primary issue that can be a big challenge. The second one is what I would call confused identity and delegated responsibility. This is kind of a personal conviction that's developed in me over the last decade or so, but I think the local church has too often lost its primary identity as God's people, and therefore we've lost our principal work as being God's kingdom mission. We've substituted our identity for a lot of other things, and when our identity changes, our focus is going to change. And so it's not to say that most pastors don't envision their church as part of God's kingdom work. It is to say that too many pastors don't envision God's kingdom mission as central to their church's vision or mission. And so it's kind of running parallel instead of being coursed through. The local church, I believe, is the center of God's kingdom mission on the earth, and we can't delegate. We can't hand off just to an organization or to some other person or people. We have to embody it, and we have to embrace it, and even press that call of God's kingdom mission to the center of our identity as the people of God. And I've heard it said many times, God doesn't have a mission for His people. He's got a people for His mission. And that is so critical for us to keep first and foremost in our minds. We can excuse sometimes that we give to a missions board or organization and rationalize that they do the rest. And I love partnering with boards and organizations, and we do that. But it really, I think, reveals an impersonal and inadequate missiology for ourselves and for our churches that has got to be expanded. The third primary issue I think that creates a challenge is busyness and demand. I don't think I really have to describe this one to anyone, but there's already so much going on that to do missions may need to shut some other programs down or give other things less priority. And sometimes it takes a lot of energy that can be difficult to envision in order to realign things. And so I think some pastors might look at the task at hand and see it as a insurmountable mountain that cannot be climbed at the time or ever. I think the fourth reason is pressure. I think pastors are under intense pressure to be, if I can use the term, professionals in every right. And I think because of that, I think that the pressure to grow our church, to keep up with prevailing voices that tell us this is what we ought to be doing as our pastor, or the weekly demand of preaching, of pastoral care, of staff management, just job responsibilities are very real and very pressing, and they don't go away. And so this constant tension and constant drain, it really becomes a pressure that can often seem unable to break out of. But I think those little choices that we make in the midst of that also reveal what we're really believing is important and lasting. And so I think that's where we have to just ask the Spirit to give us that internal conviction to lead us and to stoke and cultivate that heart. The last one I would say is just distraction and frustration. I can't tell you, some of the biggest setbacks I've felt in my leadership have been trips, short-term trips, where we've brought teams home, and the prevailing word that I heard was, it didn't work. We had a bad experience, or I didn't like it. And that can kill momentum, and it can surely kill passion as well. I think that's something we have to be constantly aware of, and really the only way to get over it or to get beyond it is to do everything we can on the front end in preparing, while at the same time understanding that sometimes God uses our biggest failures to be the biggest change agents in us and in our people. So those are never situations or events that take place that are of no use to our spiritual growth and maturity. I also think sometimes, and I offer this out of my opinion, hopefully it's humble, but I think sometimes it can be that pastors will even substitute a passion for the nations, and I put that word passion in quotation marks because they use it as a cover for a passivity towards our own neighbors. Sometimes it's easier to get excited about going to the other side of the globe than it is just to simply lead your church to cross the street and love their own neighbors that they live next to every day. And I think some churches would rather deal with the nations than mess with their neighbors. I've seen this individually. People go on mission trip and they're phenomenal evangelists. There is no distraction that they'll allow get in their way. There's no hurdle they won't leap over, and they will boldly share the gospel. But when they come home to their own confession, they just don't want to do it. And I think that's a real disconnect that we've created that becomes a distraction for us. How do we get our people as passionate about their neighbors as they are the nations? Because I don't think you'll separate the two. If you're passionate about those who live around you, you'll be passionate about the nations as well, and vice versa. So, I'd only offer one other item here. It's just simply, I think this is one big help that's been a solution for me in having a coach. You didn't ask for answers here, but I think one of the reasons they're not is because, or one of the ways that you can address at least 4, if not all 5 of these issues is engaging a coach to just help you. And so I would throw that in there kind of at the last. They help you stay on point, not get distracted. They can help you manage some of the pressure and the busyness and demand, remind you of the things that you need to be reminded of, and even help you identify and allocate resources. So that would be I know that's been a big help for me, and that would be a big help, I think, for most lead pastors.
Wow, that's an excellent picture for those of us who aren't senior pastors to kind of get inside the head of our pastor maybe and see this whole missions thing from a different perspective. And ouch, yeah, maybe you reminded us that part of the problem maybe that we don't have a balance in what, if we're only about the global and not about the local, that's something that we need to come back and rebalance in our own lives. But it's really helpful to kind of think again about the kinds of pressures that senior pastors are under. And I think we need to think about that. One pastor said to me, you know, missions usually isn't a part of a pastor's job description. And I thought, wow, that's really true. He said, I won't be fired if our church doesn't take a missions trip or fails to help plant churches in another culture. But, you know, if the worship attendance drops or the budget isn't met, those are the things I'm measured against. And I think there's two things that I hear in that. One is that we need, as you said, appreciate the kinds of pressures that pastors are under, but also as leaders in the church, whether it's an elder board or whatever, is, you know, are we making missions a part of our pastor's job description, as it were, and how does that fit? How do we all work together on that? And that's really what I want to shift to talk about next. I think there is this disconnect, and you alluded to this already. We have a disconnect, perhaps even a polarity of the missions leadership team, maybe whether it's a missions pastor or a lay team on one side, and they're kind of saying, well, the pastor isn't doing his or in some cases her job, and they're not missions minded enough, whatever that means different things to different people. And then I also talk to pastors, and pastors sometimes are frustrated because the missions leadership team is just out of sync with the church, or feels like it's sort of feeling old, and the people aren't excited about that. How do you see that? How do you look at those two sides of the maybe sometimes a blame game, or sometimes just a bit of frustration? How do you look at that as a senior pastor?
That's a great question, Ellen. I think it's a very difficult question for any single pastor to identify or to address and think that it will broadly apply across the board to all, you know, but I'll see what I can do with it here. And surely I would just want to preempt any of my questions by saying I hope they're helpful, and I hope they're received with the good intentions that I would mean for them, and never as any word of condemnation against what someone does, or, you know, the way their church operates or is designed. I think one of the, you know, there's a couple of issues I think that are really at play here. One is, you know, the church too often gets put under the category of organization, but that's really an inadequate descriptor for us. We're a family, and we're a people, and that goes back to the identity. And so when missions become something other, or become something disconnected from our identity, then I think it's easy to make it a part of the church, but not make it the central vision of the church. And so that disconnect, I think, is what we experience. And, you know, I have the advantage of I lead a church now where I planted the church 12 years ago. And so every problem that I deal with, you know, is my problem. But at the same time, every advantage we have, we've built in from very early on. But if a pastor goes to a church, he doesn't inherit all of his own problems. He inherits everyone else's problem that came before him, and then he implements his own on top of that, you know. So I think a couple of things that you've got to try and do when this missions becomes a program or some extension of an organization more than it is central to identity or vision of the church. I think you've got to know that, first of all, if there's a team in the church, maybe a missions leadership team or a council or whoever it might be that kind of leads the mission aspect, I think one of the first steps that they need to pursue is really to seeking to understand what the pastor wants, and the pastor being able to operate and help them operate within their strengths, and how it is that the church operates, so that these things don't become a distraction, but they can become a real strength. I think one of the biggest dangers is when these two get set at odds with one another. That never is helpful for the church or even individuals in the church. And so I would say challenges and conflicts are often symptoms and not the core issue, but a lack of significant sufficient communication can often be the cause of those. And so taking time to clarify vision or direction and expectations, I think that can go a long way to reconcile potentially divisive situations. And so I would say when that happens, especially if it's a new pastor or a pastor that's really wanting to reinvigorate new vision in the church, or if you're a missions pastor that wants to more deeply connect with your lead pastor, I think one big action step to do is just, instead of trying to press an agenda, first of all, stop and just pray and celebrate those past successes that God's done among your church, and really celebrate those individually, but also in those small meetings, and just kind of bring to remembrance what God has done. I think this is a biblical pattern throughout the Scripture, and use that as kind of a harmonizing moment, and then take that opportunity to remind one another and even to recommit together and to be able to clarify out of that how to move forward. So I think, I don't know if that answers the part about the disconnect, but I think so often personal relationships become the disconnect that really get us off track, and that's just a matter of reconciling with one another through the gospel and building those gospel-centered relationships so that the mission can flourish in us and then subsequently through us. I think the second issue is, and this might be a bigger issue, but I think any missions program that doesn't experience regular significant changes in strategy will always become, and probably already are, inadequate and ineffective. And if people have hinged their value, worth, or identity off of a specific model or program more than the call and the commission, this can become very divisive. And so I think you have to really work through that and try to, in love, really cultivate, the root of what's going on. I think in our world today especially, strategy is constantly changing. I tell our people change is the most constant word among us, second only to Jesus. Jesus will never change. The only thing else that won't change is that we will change. That's it's so central to the understanding of the church, but usually what causes the biggest fights or arguments or disagreements. So I think strategies constantly change because the world is changing. Our generations change, cultures change, people change, situations change, and so with that, we've got to be ready for our models and our strategies to adapt. And so often we'll create a partnership, and we just love getting in it so much we don't think anything more about it. But one thing that we try to espouse is exit strategies, or a time limit at least where we would re-envision and reignite the project, or bless one another for the time that God's brought us together, and then move our separate ways. And so any of these situations where a senior pastor or missions team experiences challenges and conflicts, I think it's a great opportunity for the gospel to be applied and God to be able to do something bigger than just redefine the strategy, but very likely deepen the relationship between the people involved. And let that be gospel moments, because the mission always flows out of healthy gospel centrality. And if we're trying to do mission by getting around the gospel, what we're doing is not really truly in the name of Christ anyway. And so I would insert again here, this is a great time for a coach, a third-party coach, even to be able to come in to guide them, and sometimes to find the root issues, but usually just be able to encourage them and give them a nudge to keep moving on. I think those questions about not just frustrations with senior pastors, but the frustration of senior pastors and those conflicts that so often arise, I, I'll tell you this. I'll give you one story. The church that I was on staff at before I planted Life Point, when I came into that church's life, they were really on the upsurge of what's been classified in kind of their history as a missional revival. And the Lord was doing some phenomenal work. But my senior pastor at the time did not come to that church with just a burning heart for the nations. And I'm qualifying his own words here, so I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but just describe the way he's described it through the years. But through this process, he was excited to see his church begin to engage the nations. But I think what surprised him more than anything else was the way that the Lord just broke his heart for the nations. And he did that by focusing on one particular nation. And I'm talking about a larger church where a lot of missions work was going on. But it was not engagement in all of the work. It was really just in focusing on one particular nation that he got engaged in, and God broke his heart to multiply that work many times over. And so I think one of my encouragements would just be, I don't think any one human heart can be equally passionate about every nation. We can be passionate about the nations, but when it comes down to praying for a people, I'm not sure that it can. But I think as we get involved and God breaks our heart for a specific people, a specific nation, a specific ethnicity, whatever the case may be, God will multiply that many times over through our congregation as he wants to see it. And so I would just encourage, whoever it is that's working with the church, with the missions team, with the pastor, cultivate that gospel work and let it be a work of the heart more than a work of the agenda, and see if God won't use it from that perspective.
Wow, you've covered a lot of territory there, and some great points. And I would that whole idea of connecting the missions vision with the church's vision, I think is a really important thing. And again, if that's a single nation or what that kind of a focus is, that it becomes organic, and that's exciting. God does a lot through that. The emphasis on change is important as well. With that, we all need to be willing to change. Just want to keep going here then and talk about, I just think, again, for us on the lay side of things, we need to be encouraged to be a cheerleader rather than a critic. Just find sometimes that we get so passionate about missions or global aspects of missions that, again, we pound it, and it feels from the other side like we're primarily a critic rather than a cheerleader. And there's just lots of things, again, that a pastor is responsible for many different things, so we can't just add one more demand onto that. We often smile that, the missions people are the ones that drop a big stack of books on the pastor's desk and expect him to read them. And one pastor said to me, missions books don't have many pictures in them either. So it's just a matter of, again, of how can we encourage a pastor. One pastor said to me, encourage a pastor to articulate how he envisions the church living out the Great Commission. Let him hear more about your thinking. Where's the intersection of what he cares about and what you care about? Work off the places of commonality. And I just think that relates in with what you've been saying there as well. Okay, the next question then. Pastors are usually overwhelmed with priorities. We've talked about that, lots of demands on their time. How can a missions pastor or a lay leader, make it easy for the senior pastor to be an enthusiastic mission supporter? What are some practical suggestions that you would have?
Well, I think the first one would just be, I would offer this as a request as much as anything, but I think praying for your pastor first is probably the biggest way that you can be a supporter, but also you can see God work in his heart. And I mean, God can do things that we can't touch, obviously. And so I think that's a big priority. And I think God always does more when we pray first. And so that's a, that's a big way. I think any way you can build relationship with them helps, because relationship that is strong builds trust, and trust just imbibes acceptance and receiving from one another and collaboration, and so that is so important. I think understanding, as you begin to communicate with one another, and understanding maybe the way he sees the prioritization of it in the church, or because he may do things that he feels like are making it a priority, and they may not be as big of a help to that missions minister or that team leader as he thinks they are, or he may just be at a loss for the best things he can do. So I would say graciously collaborating with one another, if you can have regular intervals of meeting just to collaborate those things, and give him ways that, hey, if you could do this, or if you could do that, and just little ways for him to say things or prioritize or focus on things at certain times, that can be a big help, because he doesn't see it. We do not see the church from the perspective of the other pastoral positions or leadership positions. And so, I think most senior pastors, I want to give them benefit of doubt too. They want every area of the church to succeed, and they can often do more in one statement than an individual minister or missions pastor could do in a week's worth of work, but they don't see it. And so if you help them with it, identify that for them, then I think they can often be very happy to do that. I think some of the other ways, though, is kind of moving away from the agenda and moving back more towards the relationship, just to talk about what God's doing in your heart and why you're encouraged, and talking about how God's using His ministry to grow and encourage you in your work and what you're doing. And I think when you see that, and when a lead pastor sees that God's working in that way, it's encouragement for him, but also out of his own desire, he's going to want to know how to do that more, how to be more effective and faithful with that. So I think that's a big way, taking regular time to report to him what's going on through the work, sharing those stories. I don't know any pastor that preaches on a weekly basis that isn't thrilled to have some kind of resource with fresh stories of God's move and God's work across the world. I mean, that just, just hearing those and what it does to our hearts is great, but being able to use those. So especially if it's work in the church, if that mission pastor or team leader becomes an endless source of what I call God moment stories that are too rich to ignore, he's going to use those. And he's going to use them over and over and over again. And few things are going to be more effective than when you can't get your lead pastor to shut up about what's going on in your ministry, he just keeps talking about it. And so if you'll source him with those, I think you'll find that he'll want to use them. And then those major decisions, not just reporting facts and conclusions to him, but letting him speak into those major decisions. And surely I would hope he was at some level already involved. But without placing work on his desk, get the directives from him, the agenda or the priorities, and let you go develop them, and let him help shape those through that communication. And that can happen through just, if you have a regular time with him, clarifying those goals, maybe annually or biannually, providing reports on projects, or are there geographical areas or types of work, and then celebrations too, I think, become a huge way. We duplicate what we celebrate, I think, is the adage, and so I think celebrating them becomes a huge way, just for pastors not to be overwhelmed, but to just be able to enjoy what's taking place in the church that he may or may not have had anything directly to do with.
Wow, all great points, and our time is quickly going here, and I wish we had lots more. But let me just hit a couple of other things to add or to emphasize from what you've said. Missions is about crossing cultures, and so I think, again, we need to use our mission skills with our pastor sometime. Think about how do we cross, if there's a gap there, how do we cross that? And the first thing, and again, you alluded to that as well, was, listening and discerning their heart. I think sometimes we as missions pastors are really eager to talk instead of to listen, and that relationship, that listening point is where we need to start. Then I think it's also, we need to think about engaging them where they're most comfortable. And sometimes some pastors, if they want to go overseas, they always want to preach. And, we have to find a place where that works. Maybe they like to counsel missionaries, and that sort of thing. Maybe they like to encourage other pastors. Whatever it is, let's see how we can engage them, particularly at the beginning, with where they're most comfortable. And then I just think we need to connect them to our most passionate missionaries. When workers are home, arrange a breakfast or lunch, particularly with somebody that you think can really connect with your pastor in passionate ways. Somebody said to me, get a missionary to beg your pastor to come out and see them. And that's a good thing, too. Encourage them to come. Introduce them to your visionary field partners is also a great thing. And also, by the way, include their spouses. Sometimes the connection is strongest with maybe with the wife, and that draws the spouse in as well. And then lastly here, just ask your pastor to be your missions conference speaker. Sometimes we get an outside speaker, and it's just a great opportunity to have a pastor challenge him to give the biblical foundation of missions, and in that way to engage. Just real briefly, as we wrap up here, Lane, talk to us a little bit about what you see as what makes a missions trip worthwhile for a senior pastor. And we just have a couple minutes here.
Yeah, I'll just bullet point them. For me, I learned very early on that if I was going to be involved, I had to accomplish more than just travel. And so there's several objectives I try to accomplish on every trip. The first one is just to cultivate personally a deeper heart for the nations and a deeper understanding of God's mission for the whole world, His kingdom. I think to cultivate a vision in the church, so when the people that are going with me on a trip, I try to be very intentional and intensive about what I would call just the principles and practices of disciple making, not only on the trip, but in preparation for the trip. So we read together, we pray together, we discuss and dialogue together before in our preparation. And if I can't get more of my work done on that trip, then I really don't need to take it. And I don't mean answering emails. I mean pouring into it, investing in the lives of people, so that comes about. And then the third objective is just cultivating a call in our people. I don't want to walk away and see them go, I had a great time because the pastor told me I did. I want to see them walk away and be more in love with Jesus and have a deeper sense of the commission of God upon their life to make disciples of all nations.
Wow, that's a great summary there, I think. And thanks so much for your sharing. You just have a wealth of experience and encouraging. To me, it's really encouraging to hear you talk about that and give us some real practical sides of all of that. I would also just mention to our listeners that Catalyst does postings every month. You can get all of our back issues, but we've done one specifically on this topic in which we interviewed not only Pastor Lane, but some others as well, in Igniting Pastors' Missions Fire. So I'd just encourage you to check that out. And Matthew, I'll hand the mic back to you.
Yes, Ellen and Lane, thank you very much. Really rich content. I appreciate the heart and also the intelligence behind it. So this is your opportunity, audience. Let me remind you to address Ellen and Lane with your questions. Hi to Ellen from Kevin McGee in Maryland. Any extra ideas on how a senior pastor can influence other senior pastors to have a heart for global impact? So how does one senior pastor influence others? Ellen and Lane.
You want to go first, Ellen?
I would just mention that in the postings that I just alluded to, we did ask that question because I think it's a good one, Kevin, and I think that there's a lot of ways that actually, if you as a missions pastor or a lay leader can connect your pastor to another pastor, that's a great opportunity to see God work in that way. There's passion is ignites as we get close to the fire. So, Lane, what would you add to that?
I think I would add networks, cohorts, and coaching. For me, staying in regular fellowship with other pastors through networks is critical, and we've even brought in resources to help train. Like we used Upstream Collective and Larry McCreary, and I know that's how I got connected to you, Ellen. And my fellow pastors in our network and that I fellowship with, I just invited them in to see if they could benefit. And so I know from things like that, for me, those cohorts and networks become critical for my own encouragement to listen to what God's doing in other pastors and to continue to grow that in my own heart.
Lane, this is anonymous. Lane, this question is for you. I love my pastor, I love my church, but he does not share your understanding of the Great Commission. We are passionate about reaching our neighbors, but there is little emphasis on reaching the nations. What do I do?
Yeah, so this is from a missions pastor?
I think it's just someone from a church, nothing specific.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you're not on staff, yeah, I don't know to change if you were on staff, but, you know, I go back and just say, first of all, you got to pray, and you don't have to get on an airplane to reach the nations, especially in this day and time. And so more and more in our cities, you can reach the nations right here at home. And I wouldn't say that should substitute for crossing the oceans, but at the very least, it can become a catalyst for it. And so, you know, pray for him. And if your heart is for the nations, go to your closest access to them and let God use you as a model for how that can happen.
Good. This comes from Frank Yang. As a missions organization representative, if I only have 1 to 2 times max to interact with the senior pastor in person, I assume that's per year, what would you suggest for the agenda and focus to best begin to engage them? So I have limited time with the senior pastor. What does that meeting look like?
Find out what his biggest needs are so that what you can offer him is he's not able to say no to.
Yeah. I'll throw some in here. I was the missions pastor at a very large church for over 10 years. And with all due respect to missions organizations, often I'd have a meeting and there was little time listening. You know, as you mentioned, Ellen, listening so important. They tried to sell me on their organization's vision as opposed to hearing about the global vision God had given to our church. So after I, you know, frankly had been insulted in some cases, they asked me for money. And I think listening is critical and really realizing that they probably have a global vision and how to coax that out of them and be a resource to help them fulfill that is really critical. And I know it's a very simplified idea, but I think the mission organizations need to, especially in this new paradigm we're talking about, they shouldn't be doing missions for churches. They should be doing missions with churches. And that's just a small word, but it's a big distinction. So I don't know if that's helpful, Frank. I want to stick that out there.
I would agree, Matthew. I think it's really good.
This is a tough one, Ellen, Lane. Again, there's some comments here about love for their church, but for several years they've been encouraging the church. They prayed. They've done these things you've talked about, and there just seems to be very little momentum building for any type of global outreach. A lot of emphasis on domestic building funds. Would there ever be a time where I should think about leaving my church? I know that's a very heavy question. Church membership is an important thing. We're a part of a family, as you mentioned, Lane. So I know that's a tough one, but I feel it does need to be asked here. Someone put it out there.
I think that's a good question, and I would just, one of the things that we haven't mentioned because it wasn't really the focus here, but I think there's a lot that individuals can do, whether they're lay individuals or the missions pastor, even if the senior pastor isn't particularly passionate. So before you pick up and leave, part of it maybe you haven't given it enough time, but also think about what your personal impact can be. I have seen and heard from so many people whose lives were impacted not necessarily by the senior pastor for missions, but by someone in their church who had that passion and walked alongside of them, mentored them, encouraged them, gave them a book to read or a video, took them on a trip, took them under their wing. And so just consider, and that's, like I said, that's not particularly our topic today, but again, it doesn't all hinge, the church is not just the senior pastor, the church is all of us, and we can have, and maybe what he or she sees you doing is also then a model for developing their interest in the missions aspect. Go ahead, Lane, what would you say?
Well, I would just completely agree with what Ellen just said. The quick answer is sure there's a time you should leave, but it shouldn't be very quick. It should never be done without season after season of prayer and serious consideration and even gracious conversation. And those are hard things to give any real response to. That, but I would just say this. Your senior pastor is most likely not going to have the greatest heart for missions in the world, or he probably would be on the mission field. God called him to lead the local church, and his heart for missions is part of that call, but it's not going to necessarily be the hottest part of the burn of his call. And so I think that's one thing you have to keep in consideration too. But again, what Ellen said, I think pastors can be persuaded by personal models of mission work among their own people. And because God's given them a heart for those people in that church, he'll use those people to break his heart for other areas.
That's a great word. So, let's see here. Again, I got some anonymous people on remain anonymous. So if a missionary is seeking to partner with churches in the area, how can I help the pastors I meet with to see the value of getting involved in global missions? It may be the same question and asked a little different way. So it's a missionary seeking to partner with local churches. How can you help the pastor see the value of involvement?
I'll go back to one simple principle, and it's the principle of relationship. If you want partnership, if you want money, resources, funding, if you try to do that outside of relationships with people, I just think you're spinning your wheels. And it takes time, it takes a lot of energy and effort, and if you try to forego that, whatever you do build is going to be fairly shallow. And so I would try to build relationships with the people, because once they identify you as family, it's going to be hard for all those other things not to follow.
I would just add to that I think that sometimes missionaries want the pastor to be very interested in their ministry, but I'm not sure if they're very interested in the church's ministry. You know, are they really? Again, it comes back to that listening and the relationship. Are they ready to be passionate about listening and caring and praying with that pastor for the church? I think if they do that and they begin to share his heart for what's happening in the local church, that there's almost always going to be a reciprocity of that pastor then is going to also have a passion, will grow in his or her compassion for what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a good word, Ellen. In 1615's experience, we often come alongside churches that have, some aggressive domestic work going on, and they just haven't made sense of the nation's peace. And, there's always the concern of one overshadowing the other, but the truth is a strong global vision that's holistic will give, emphasis to both. They should be complementary, not in conflict with one another. It should be neighbors and nations. So I just want to emphasize that there. I want to draw attention one more time to Ellen's conference that's coming up, Interchange 2016, May 11th and 12th. You can register at catalystservices.org. The topic is Missional and money. Also want to recommend Catalyst Services in general. They help missions organizations and local churches expand and improve their global efforts. They do that through resources like today, connecting. They're great networkers, and then also they provide a variety of training. One more time, the mission table. Second episode will roll out April the 12th. The topic is, does child sponsorship really work? We hope you'll tune in for that. And then another important subject, knowing who to send. How can you predict missionary fruitfulness and failure before they actually end up on the mission field? So again, being proactive when it comes to selecting and sending your people to the mission field. I'm going to leave my information up right there. Wayne, you have, I didn't pay Wayne to do that, but he mentioned coaching several times, and Ellen and I both do some of those things. But 1615 Church Missions Coaching, we help churches to clarify their global vision and strategy, and then we help them to mobilize the whole congregation to be a part of that global vision. So there's resources on our website, all types of great things. And I'm going to leave these two slides up just for a minute. If people want to write down Ellen or Lane's contact information, they both said they'd be happy to answer more of your questions if you had any. Again, Ellen, thank you so much for the time you put in preparing for this. And Lane, thank you for just sharing out of your heart and your own experiences. I know it was a blessing to me personally, and I'm sure it was a blessing to all who participated. So I want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded and will be available within the week. So thanks again, Ellen and Lane. Thanks for our live audience for being with us today. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thank you so much for listening.